have some people coming in last morning of the conference, and you can tell the breakfast area is filling up slower than it has the other mornings. My name is Wayne Lund. I'm a senior systems engineer for VMware, and we had hoped to have Michael Minella, who's the author of Pro Spring Batch and is also now an employee for VMware and also a member of the Java expert group for JSR-352. He already had other plans. It's his anniversary this week, and so wasn't able to join us. And Jonathan Fullam is also is a systems engineer with the vFabric group. And I am a member of the Java expert group working on the Java batch standardization. I happen, for good or evil, to have been the application architect for Accenture when we contributed Java batch to SpringSource. So I drove that effort for Accenture and have since come to VMware, been here for about 18 months. We wanted to provide you an introduction to the JSR-352 today. We're still in we just barely released the public review of the specifications, so hopefully some of you that are working with Spring Batch and are interested in this standard will take the opportunity to go out there and review it. It's really important to get your feedback. And I'm going to cover for you, obviously we've had self-interest as we've joined this committee that we wanted to protect and preserve what we've done for the last 5-6 years in working with the Spring Batch effort so that we could influence the spec. It's been an interesting group of people that are on the spec. We have an Oracle representative, a RedHat representative, a couple of people from the IBM team. A member is from UBS, which is one of the largest Spring Batch implementations that I know of anyway. Does Joe Pullen happen to be here? Just curious. Okay, he's a member of the spec committee. And then Michael Minella was an independent member as just the author of the Pro Spring Batch. So that is the committee membership that's been working in the expert group. So what I'll do is cover with you one of our original topics with the committee was how do we talk about batch. It was actually surprising. I know I don't look old enough to you guys to have been a batch developer, but I've actually had quite a bit of experience in the batch world. And it was kind of surprising, even as we started to talk about batch, the nouns and the verbs meant different things to members of the committee. And so trying to achieve this kind of domain language of how we talked about batch was actually harder than we thought it was going to be. And so I'll also point out, and I'll go through quite a bit of detail of the nuances between the batch programming model, what it looks like in the Spring Batch versus what's being proposed with the specification. And then there's a few things that's actually really soft right now is to the batch runtime specification, meaning how do you tie in as a implementer of the spec with the batch runtime and what it means to be a container. I've already mentioned why we participated, and I also have felt good about, to this point, the validation that it's been for us of the work that's gone into Spring Batch. And in fact, when you read the spec, we actually gave permission to use the text and documents from the Spring Batch reference implementation or documentation, reference documentation. So you'll find some sections of the spec that are verbatim as to what you can read on the reference documentation for Spring Batch, including the diagrams. And so this is material that's been out there for 6 years if you've been working with Spring Batch, and you'll find that it's in the spec and it's familiar to you. So let's move into the domain language of batch and how we talked about it. I want to this is our old canonic picture of how we describe the layering in Spring Batch. And the part that you need to understand that really was the heart of the specification is really around batch core. Batch core is where we talk about these ideas of what a job is, what a step is. We introduced some new terms, and it was actually something, it was the term was invented by Dave Sire with how we talked about chunks. There was no idea of a chunk to any of the other members of the spec committee. So we had a lot of discussion around what chunking actually meant. The other part that was interesting was that there was no agreement on the approach to partitioning. So that became quite a long discussion, is what does it mean to partition batch jobs? So I'll go into detail on that. What I want to point out is that the execution environment and how that's implemented is not covered in the spec, nor is there any reference to the infrastructure, meaning like our retry templates, our repeat templates, and the fact that we have a transaction platform already available to us from SpringSource. We actually did a pretty good job as we've gotten into the Java standardization of not letting Springisms bleed into the developer portion. And so there will need to be some adjustments, and it'll be obvious to those of you who have used Spring Batch. But really at the batch core level and the domain language that's been settled on for the Java batch, and I'll try to keep that. Java batch is referring to the specification. Spring Batch is obviously our implementation of batch. So this picture has actually become more meaningful to me, which is another one of our standard pictures we use to describe Spring Batch, in the fact that we separated the core parts of batch that a developer needs to know about. You know, how do you write item readers and writers and processors and configure the job and the language of batch and the infrastructure implementing and we provide a lot of default, simple versions that have actually been workhorses for us. And then the fact that it's dependent on the Spring framework, and we get so much. And one of the things I've noticed about being on an expert group is that we have a single, it's the most homogeneous architecture when you're using the Spring framework, because we utilize so much. We don't have to have discussions about how are we going to do expression language. I had not realized that there's still no standard specification language in the JEE community. So this whole language, when for us, we just use spell, the Spring expression language, actually became a fairly intense conversation at one point on what the syntax of the expression language for batch was going to be. We did finally settle on spell-like syntax for the expression language, but it wasn't without some discussion, since there is no standard in the JEE space. The other thing is that the assumptions from the other vendors, who tend to be, I wouldn't say biased, that's the wrong term, but they're JEE vendors, so obviously they're pushing for a transaction platform as supplied by JEE. I'll talk about that more, what it means to have global and local transactions. But my point is that the assumptions made about transactions are different from your point of view and had to be worked out. Dependency injection, still probably not completely resolved. I'm not even sure where we've landed, but I'll point at that at the end. And I bring these points up again because I'm hoping that I'm addressing a critical review group, that as you're reviewing what I'm presenting to you, that you, if you have opinions, go out and make your comments how you want to see these issues resolved. There's a lot of issues that have been opened, and we are working through them and trying to respond to them as quickly as we can. So you notice that the Java Batch DSL borrows from Spring Batch. And it was interesting that really the only thing we shared in common as we started talking together was job and step. There was no idea with other members of the committee of a step type, and the fact that we have a chunk step type versus a tasklet step type. And but this picture that's in the spec, you'll recognize from our Spring Batch. Java Batch is using the same thing. I'll point out that it doesn't mean exactly the same thing. So for example, there is no notion of job repository in the spec. We have an interface for a job operator, so there's an implied way of storing the metadata as you process the batch job, but the job repository is not specified. So there's no appendix section that says, here's what the schema looks like for storing the meta information in the processing of batch. That's a vendor implementation. I'll also point out that one of the biggest discussions we had at the beginning of the expert group meetings was what was the scope of batch. And there was kind of two ends of the spectrum. This was actually one of the initial challenges that we had when we first started working on Spring Batch, was how big was batch. So part of what we did with the Accenture batch that we brought to Spring Batch was that we knew ours was too big. It had integration in it. It had not so much the scheduling, but it made some assumptions, and we had to tear it out because we were using a particular third-party scheduler as we launched our batch jobs. So part of the thinking around Spring Batch was exactly what was Spring Batch going to do. And we realized that the vendor, some of the, one in particular, IBM, Chris Vignola is the lead, who I compliment a lot. I think he's done a really good job of shepherding the different interests on the expert group. But the Spring Batch, or the IBM batch, has a much larger scope than what Spring Batch does. And part of that was because they didn't have the idea of step types. And so a step was a very abstract concept, and you could do just about anything in a step. So things like FTP a file, or move files, or delete files, or some of the things that we always describe as integration concerns are done in their batch architecture. They also have a very sophisticated batch container, and that includes they take care of dispatching the jobs, and partitioning meant something very different to that. To their interests. So getting the committee, first of all, to agree integration wasn't going to be in the scope. Scheduling wasn't, they also have a built-in scheduler, even though they integrate with third-party schedulers. We wanted to make sure we divorced scheduling concerns, divorced integration concerns, and just focused again. So the end result was that the scope of batches pretty synonymous with Spring Batch. You'll see almost no difference. That actually became a little bit problematic, and we end up tabling some of the topics around what does batch mean in distributed mode. So I'll talk about the changes in partitioning, but we ended up not addressing distributed batch architecture with the spec. So if the spec is successful and it goes through another version, you may see that topic addressed. But for now, that's a vendor-specific implementation. So those of you who know Spring Batch know that this is a familiar picture. Doesn't mean exactly the same with Java Batch. And the difference is that we still have a job launcher, an interface for a job launcher that can be, you get that from the job operator. But the job parameters, we ended up settling, and here's the part of working with a committee and interested in your perspective on this, but the other batch vendors uniquely used a UUID to uniquely identify their jobs. And so a job gets launched, the parameters have nothing really to do with identifying the job. So the system creates a unique identifier for the job, and the parameters get passed in. And they actually went through a lot of their customer experiences with why they changed job parameters as they were passed into the job runtime. In the Spring Batch world, you know that that's very different. When we launch a job, the job parameters uniquely identify. So I added to the slide, this is really more of a natural key approach that we take for identifying a job. Change the job parameters, you've got a different job. And as long as you use those same job parameters, you'll end up with different job instances and executions that run against those instances. As far as the way the developer works in configuring the job, it's expanded now with what's available. So there's, we at the very end made a switch to make sure we provided interfaces for everything, but in the beginning was almost purely an annotation-driven approach. But you'll see that there's both ways are provided. And then as I mentioned, there is no, it's all vendor specific on how the job repository will work. So I added that term on the other side, what it meant. We always use the example. You call this an end-of-day job, and then you label the job parameter coming in, and then that first attempt will store job execution and store the status of that execution for future use, and then you can use the job operator to get to that. So interested in people's opinions, that's one of the slight differences between the Java Batch versus Spring Batch. Secondly, the step. The step is largely the same. The big discussion we had around Step, Spring Batch, you remember, introduced the idea of step scope. And the step scope was to allow for us to have parallel steps and to have the artifacts within a step be created during the initialization and running of a step. Obviously, to the other members of the committee, the perspective was from CDI and what CDI scopes are. Now, having been in the Spring world as long as I've been, I've yet to have written an application with CDI. So some of the conversation with the CDI and what CDI scopes meant is still kind of a little bit fuzzy in what the differences are with that, with the way that the others will implement that. The job operator stayed. It has an annotation. It was actually adopted almost verbatim, including the method names. Everything comes from Spring Batch. So Java Batch will feel like Spring Batch in terms of the job operator. Those of you who have used the interface with Job Operator and Job Explorer understand that the Job Explorer has a little bit of, it uses more complex types than Job Operator. Job Operator uses simple types, but the decision of the committee was to collapse the Job Explorer and the Job Operator. So there is no Job Explorer in the Java Batch. But there is a Job Launcher interface that also, I'll show you later, annotation or interface driven. And I actually show that job repository, but I do not believe there's an interface for. I should have had an X in job repository. It's all the interface for Job Operator is going to be describing that. All of the same intents of what you do with the Job Operator, including being able to inspect jobs, inspect job execution, context, and step executions, all those intentions have remained with Job Operator, so it will feel very familiar. Yes? Are you saying exposing the metrics? So there, I have a slide later on. He's asking about what do we do to expose the metrics on the batch runtime, and there is an interface for exposing the metrics that gives us, I'll show you all the metrics that we do expose. I've already said this later. There is one other artifact that's put in the kind of as a layer on how do you get to the job operator, right? What does the bootstrapping process look like to get your runtime initialized? And there is a batch runtime artifact that you access. That's actually one of the parts, and Jonathan will explain it more, that we'd hope there'd be a little bit more definition around with the reference implementation, which was done by IBM, but it wasn't completed in this first draft of the reference implementation. So it's still a little bit soft as to how we grab our environment so that we can use it. But that is how you get access to your job operator and can launch your jobs. And then, obviously, that's your launching point for the job launcher. So I want to talk about kind of the meat of Spring Batch has always been around readers, processors, writers. How many in the room do have Spring Batch experience, have actually written Spring Batch jobs? Okay, so just such a familiar and easy to use concept. Was not, there was no other vendor that came to the table that really had this idea of this, you know, Rob Harrop called a three-closure process, 3 closures in batch. We actually, when we introduced it from Accenture, had 5. We reduced it down to these 3. And so I'll explain quickly through these. Now, what's kind of interesting is as we've talked with different customers ourselves, be very interested in your own experience. We don't get a lot of people asking for a lot of enhancements to Java Batch outside of this area. We have people now who are asking for more types of readers and writers, like first the issue that got reopened. I think Dave Sire opened it about a year ago, but the project wasn't quite far enough along. But it's been reopened around creating item readers and writers for all of the data, Spring data projects, right? And so I'll highlight that as we move through that. But this has been a workhorse, and we have provided a number of readers and writers. How many of you have written custom readers and writers for different types of channels? Okay, so you have written them. So We provide almost every flavor of JDBC, ORMs, IBATIS, flat file item readers. The flat file item readers are configurable, so they support just about any type of flat file configuration that you would need, whether it has a header and a footer, whether they're mixed record types, whether they're comma delimited, fixed length delimited. The Spring Batch has always supplied that. None of that is specified in the Java Batch. That's a vendor implementation. So really the audience of the Java Batch was to people who are creating new item readers and writers. And so that was one of the concerns we had. But this picture is just to illustrate the types that you have, including, is Chris Schaefer in the room by chance? Okay, Chris Schaefer, I saw him at the conference earlier this week, committed the AMQP reader and writer, one of our first commits on the 2.2 edition. And so we're seeing these new channels and new types of readers and writers come out. And so you'll see us start to support. Now, from the vFabric point of view, one of our products is Gemfire. For a lot of our POCs, we've been using a rawer version, but are hoping to take advantage of the idea of Gemfire writers, not so much readers, but writers in particular, for helping to bootstrap large volumes on a Gemfire architecture. And I've worked with teams, and I saw a blog with MongoDB using the Spring Data MongoDB template and Java Batch to MongoDB, and I've actually helped clients who are writing Spring Batch jobs to MongoDB. So we're seeing this interest now in expanding the scope of what item readers and writers can address. So, and I've already mentioned the fact that this is not part of the spec, only the interface for how you create these. So the portability of the libraries that we have Jonathan will actually show you how we took one of our samples. The interfaces, as I said, there was kind of a last review before the draft went public by the JEE committee, and there was a comment there. We had had numerous conversations ourselves because, for my opinion, when I'm implementing an item reader or a writer, it's nice to have the interfaces. And you know how the Spring Batch hierarchy, you see kind of an abstract item stream reader or writer, and then you can build off that. It takes care of a lot of the work for you. And that wasn't provided with kind of this annotation approach that you see to the right. But the thing I was concerned about is that you'll notice from the interface doesn't match Spring Batch. Spring Batch's interface for item reader is simply read, because the abstract concept could be for JMS or for whatever it is. Even a simple thing like open and close does not always apply to your reader and writer. So something that we'll be reviewing and be raising an issue on as it just came out. The writers is just the reverse of readers, and again we have a rich library already of these types that you can use for writing. And we're seeing again the same idea of having, and I don't know how many of you saw Cost and Lowe's presentation the other day, but a lot of work being done with the Spring Batch Hadoop interface and writing to a Hadoop grid. And so we're finding this simple architecture for writing is very applicable to the NoSQL movement, and with the Spring Data project, we kind of have a nice layer on top of all the variety of choices that we have under that. And so I'm just showing the same thing again, that there's always two approaches. You can approach via interfaces or annotation. And I'm letting my opinion leak through here, but personally in this particular case, I prefer developing to interfaces over annotations. But I'm certainly interested in how the community feels about taking that approach. Spring Batch introduced annotations when JDK 1.5 came out, but you'll notice that most of the places where we used annotations was in the areas of listeners and the life cycle of managing the batch jobs. And finally, on just one note on item processor, its meaning is the same. There's not a lot we can provide out of the box with processor, because that is what makes your step processing unique, is what you do as far as transforming or business logic or computing inside the batch job. So the processors, most of what you see that's in the Spring Batch samples or in the core are really just that. They're samples. They're ideas for how you can use the processor. But we've certainly been at clients who have done some pretty rich things inside the processing model. And so I showed again the idea that you can choose an annotation-based approach at the app process item. @name, by the way, is used on almost everything and something that we share with JEE. And finally, the last part of the DSL as far as the step processing is in the chunk-oriented processing. And like I said, all good batch architectures already understood the idea that you tend to process large streams of information and have your commit intervals at as high a level as possible, meaning if possible, process 1,000 items before you do a commit. So the idea of a checkpoint or a commit interval was very common, but nobody else had the idea of a chunk in the same way that Spring Batch does. And so we did push for moving the chunk semantics into the Java Batch. So Java Batch does have this same idea, although there are some things you need to understand about transaction processing if you're configuring and using listeners on chunks that the spec doesn't address. But at least the DSL for what chunk means as far as reading and caching those reads or buffering those reads and then sending items to a chunk processor and managing it in that way. In fact, that same diagram. So I'm just going to point out what you're seeing here, and I know you can't read it, but on the right you'll see the Spring Batch. It's a Spring Batch XSD file, and on the left is the Java JSL .xsd file, and there are subtle differences in the way we lay these out. So checkpoint policy, because again, we always talked about different ways of being able to commit the batch jobs. So for example, we knew that some people would want like a time-based approach to commit intervals rather than necessarily always being on a chunk boundary. But in the spec, there was a lot more weight given to like a time-based commit point rather than a chunk boundary commit point. What that does is it overloads the meaning of the term commit interval, because if I'm using it with a time-based policy, that commit interval means the time that takes, whereas if I'm using it with a chunk-based policy, that's how many items are being processed before the checkpoint. Therefore, we have a checkpoint algorithm that's also in the spec. So conceptually a lot already in Spring Batch, but it's slightly different with a Java Batch in the way it's managed. In the Spring Batch, you'll see it as a chunk. I believe we called it a chunk completion policy. So we always had the idea of these policies that developers could introduce to control the way commits were handled or transaction management was handled. But by and large, how many have used anything besides chunk policies for commit? Anybody? Okay, so you'll see that's a little bit different in the Java Batch, was the idea that they wanted to have things based on time or custom. Now, we've always also supported custom-based. I just haven't seen it yet in the years that we've had it. And again, the checkpoint algorithm, which is what in Spring we'd call a completion policy, has an annotation-based or an interface-based approach to it. So what I'm going to do at this point is I want to turn it over to Jonathan. Jonathan was very helpful because he's been one of our engineers that's helped implement Java Batch for City of New York. And one of the challenges we had was, could we take some of the batch jobs from our Spring Batch samples project and run it inside the RI for Java Batch? So we'll turn it over to Jonathan, and he'll let you see his experiences.
So good morning, everybody. Before I dive into the demonstration, I do want to tell you that before he had asked me to help him with this presentation, I was following his updates because I knew he was a member of the expert group. And like he said, I used Spring Batch in the past for some of our customers. And that's why I had a deep interest, because I do believe personally that Spring Batch is the best way to implement batch processing with Java, right? So when he asked me, I was very excited because now it gave me a chance to look at the specification. It gave me a chance to dive into the reference implementation. These are things that we're encouraging you to do as well. And it was validation for me that indeed Spring Batch was highly influential on the JSR-352 specification. So really, that's going to be a core point I'm going to try to make through showing some of these demonstrations. And that is that, first of all, we did influence the JSR-352. And I'm going to demonstrate that by showing you by taking an existing sample that comes with Spring Batch and making minimal changes, not changing any reference implementation code, and making minimal changes to the specification language, how that job is defined, and maybe just a little bit of coding that I'll walk through around wrapping item readers and item writers. But also, I hope from this demonstration you'll get a good overview of what a JSR-352, the Java batch job, might look like, right? And the final thing that you'll get from this is that Spring Batch's or Spring's implementation of JSR-352 is going to allow you to use all the great pieces of the Spring ecosystem that you're used to, right? So that's going to be a lot of benefit that's going to be provided to you as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to review the existing football job. It's a sample job that comes with Spring Batch. How many people here are familiar with the football job from Spring Batch? Okay, we got one person or two people. So it'll be a review for you guys and somewhat of an introduction to the rest of you. So if you look here, and what I'm showing you is a graphical representation of this job, which you can see when you're using Spring Tool Suite and working with Spring Batch. But this is a simple job. It comes with Spring Batch. You can download it from the Spring Batch website or from a GitHub location. But it's going to take a CSV file which represents football players. Their ID, their first name, last name, when they were born, their debut year, things like that. And it's going to parse that comma-separated value file and load it into a database table. Now the next step is the game load step is going to take a similar file, a CSV file that contains information such as their statistics for specific games. So every game they played in, what is that player's rushing yards? This is American football, right? Their passing yards, their points scored, those sorts of statistics. And then the final step, the player summarization, is going to take all that data from those two newly populated tables, read it, and then summarize it. So now you'll have a single record for each player that says, this is their statistics across all their different games, right? And it'll persist that to a database. So again, remember, this is our Spring Batch sample, right? I'm not into the Java batch yet. So if you look at this XML file, and if you're familiar with Spring Batch, this will look very familiar as well. Here I'm defining the job, or we've defined the job, football job, and you can see here we're using the concept of a chunk. And what's great about the chunk tasklet is that you have the ability to specify a reader and a writer, which points to a Spring Bean which is configured, and ultimately one of the out-of-the-box item readers or writers that you use within Spring Batch. So if we drill down in, for example, the player file item reader, what you see here is, indeed, we're using the out-of-the-box flat file item reader. This is one of the benefits of using Spring Batch. You get all this rich library of readers and writers. As Wayne mentioned, you can do some pretty neat things. You can specify purely through configuration what are the different fields that are in that file, how is it delimited, in this case it's comma delimited, and then there's this concept of a field set mapper, and this is a class which you can provide which will allow you to take the data after it's been parsed and put it into a domain object. So in this case, player field set mapper is simply taking the data that it's reading from that file and putting it into player objects. And actually I could just really quickly show you what that looks like. See, so again, we have these player objects. So this data will then be passed to the writer and persisted into a database in chunks, right? So now let's start looking a little bit at the Java batch reference implementation. So when I first started looking at the reference implementation, what I found out was the concept of a batch artifact factory. That's something that is currently talked about in the specification. is hard-coded within the reference implementation. So this is an early version of the reference implementation, but what that meant is that I don't have the ability to easily replace that batch artifact factory with the Spring container of dependency injection. So the first thought was maybe I need to change the reference implementation code, but I decided against that, right? And what they're doing with this hard-coded batch artifact factory is they have this batch.xml file which specifies your batch artifacts, ultimately your item readers and writers. So you can see here a flat file item reader, and this is my version of it for the football job. The implementation is using something that I wrote called a Spring flat file item reader adapter, which we'll take a look at. Now this batch.xml file, like I said, is not as part of the specification, but just in the reference implementation, the current version, this is how they're implementing the batch artifact factory. So if we take a look now at my version of the football job for Java Batch, for running on the JSR-352 reference implementation, you can see it's similar to what we saw within the Spring Batch sample job, right? There's not a lot of differences, and I'll walk through what the differences are. So when I was thinking about how am I going to get those readers and writers to be seen by the reference implementation, the first thought was, well, maybe what I can just do is wrap those in the annotations, right? At the time, the reference implementation doesn't use the interface approach that Wayne specified is going to be an option for you. So maybe I can wrap those in annotations and delegate to our flat file item readers and writers. But the problem that I had was then what I needed to do was build in to the reference implementation the ability to configure these, right? So remember, it will take a quick look again. If you look at how our reader and writers are configured, this flat file item reader, there's a lot of things there for me already. I'm already doing this. It's already provided out of the box. So I didn't want to have to change a lot of that. So what I ended up doing is I took advantage of this concept of properties within the JSR-352 and within Java Batch, which allows you to pass specific values, string-based values, into your implementations of an item reader or writer. So for example, this flat file item reader here, if we look at the batch file now, that refers to something called Spring flat file item reader adapter, which I mentioned I provided implementation for. And if we look a little closer into this, you'll see first here, this batch property up top, this is that batch property that I'm passing in. So here I'm passing in something called player file item reader. So let's go back again. So now I have the name of a Spring Bean. Now inside this open, I annotate this method with the open, right? What I'm doing is I'm calling a singleton instance of our Spring Bean factory. So there's something called a singleton bean factory locator. If you look at the Java doc for that within our Spring Source Java doc, it'll recommend that you use this very sparingly because what you're doing is you're coupling things in a way that's kind of against the grain with all the benefits of dependency injection. But a good use case for something like this is when you need to do a little bit of glue code. So if you have a third-party piece of code or application that's managing its own objects, creating its own objects in a specific way, and you want to integrate with some Spring Beans, this is how you can do it. So this allowed me to load the exact context files from the out-of-the-box Spring Batch job. So those item readers and writers that I showed you, which are already configured, I have access to them now. Now, if you look down a little further now, when I annotate, for example, read item, so this method is what's going to read each player or each game from that file, I can simply delegate that to that already instantiated and managed Spring Bean, which is our flat file item reader. And really, I did the same thing, right? For example, the football job takes advantage of a JDBC cursor item reader. You can see here it's very similar. I'm getting the same singleton instance in this open method, and again, I'm delegating the reading of each one of those items, which ultimately is going to be from a database, right, in this step. So if you look at this now, let's look at what some of the differences are from the Spring Batch job. So you can see down here I commented it out. But again, it's those three steps. We're passing in file item readers and writers. So again, only because I needed to integrate with this existing version of the reference implementation, I have this concept of passing in properties of the Spring Beans. But you can imagine in our actual implementation of this specification, you won't need to do that, right? Because the batch artifact factory will be Spring. It will be the Spring container. The other thing here you may have noticed is this dummy processor that I have here. Now the reason I put that in is when I started looking at the reference implementation, and this is why we're encouraging people to play with stuff like this and look at the specification, I realized that the specification dictates that processor is a mandatory piece of a chunk. Now we know from using Spring Batch that there's lots of jobs where you don't need a processor. There are a lot of jobs where you read data from a file, or you read it from another source, and then you end up writing it to another target source. So this was something where I was able to find and then open a ticket with the expert group and get positive feedback, and now they'll be removing that from the specification. So that's something that we want you guys to do as well. Find things like this and provide some feedback. So ultimately now what I'll do is I'll run this job, and out of the box, the football job, it does provide you with different size files. So in this case, I'm using the largest kind of files, the most players, the most games. It comes out to almost 60,000 different games, which we will be processing now and then summarizing. So you see here, I'm expressing a count query in this Postgres database, and you can see indeed the games are increasing because right now we're going through that game load step. And once that gets to about 60,000, what will happen is we'll see in here that the job actually does complete. We go through the player summarization, and here, the job completed. And if we go to player summary now, we'll check the count, and you can see it summarized it down to about 6,000. So we took 60,000 different games, summarized it per player down to 6,000, and you can take a quick look, and here's what some of the data might look like. So it's the different players, their IDs, and a summary of their statistics. So really, in summary from this demonstration, I hope that I made it clear that really, by making very minimal changes, right? This looks very similar. I had to do some things based on the current state of the reference implementation. I had to wrap those item readers and writers with an annotation approach and delegate, right, to our Spring Beans. But those are things in our ultimate implementation of the Java batch will be provided for you. So if you're familiar with Spring Batch, moving over to the standard Java batch implementation shouldn't be a big deal. So, thank you. Yeah, so the question is, you saw me outputting some log. I put that in there. Is there any kind of is there another mechanism to kind of plug in or something that'll force? And what we've seen in a lot of implementations of Spring Batch is the concept of the listener artifacts and those sorts of things. They do give you the ability to do things like log if we needed to skip an error within a file, or log completions and those sorts of things. And really, if you play around with Spring Batch, and we encourage you to download the samples, there's a concept of the Spring Batch admin where you can actually go in there and see all kinds of statistics. How long did your batch jobs run? What are the item counts and item failures and those sorts of things. So.
Okay, so I agree that's there, but that's happened only after the job ends. It's a long processing job. The main challenge we have today is that you probably just say I'm running, but then you have no idea how many record processed, whether it's just running hanging in a thread or keep running or it's actually doing something. So that's the main challenge we have today.
Oh, and you're saying you're not getting enough information while it's running? Okay, because a Spring Batch does expose, like he was mentioning with the Spring Batch admin, you can see some running information at the checkpoints, right? At the commit points, you'll see what the status of a step. So we should talk afterwards to see what else you're not getting that you'd like to see. Which actually brings me to one other point too. I wanted to make sure I talk about some of the things that didn't get addressed, but one of them was around instrumentation. Right? There's no discussion in the spec per se about how, like for Spring Batch, we expose these things via JMX. And then with the Spring Batch admin, we expose them via RESTful services. There's been no work in the Java Batch spec on instrumentation and how we expose those metrics. So that's a good question. So I did want to get into the actual specification language. We always refer to this in the Spring Batch world as our batch namespace, right? And we kind of live in the editor when you're configuring a job so that you can use your control space with your XML to complete that. So it's a little bit different terminology as we came to the committee. It's referred there as the Job JSL.XSD, but it's still an XML schema or an XSD, that we're using to model the domain language for batch. And we actually came to a point, largely initially because of Jonathan's work, there were a number of new issues that were created against the spec and the RI, and we realized that it wasn't going to be enough just to specify the domain language, and so the actual XSD file has been pulled into the spec, and a lot of the, probably 25 issues popped up immediately as we started to compare. So I'm comparing against the second version of the Java Batch job specification language. But there's a number of issues that we're working out right now, so it's a little bit early to show this as being final. I know you can't see this, but what I did was open the editor inside of the Spring Tool Suite and open the schemas side by side. And the first thing, if you're to do this on your own, you'll see there are a lot of similarities, but whoever the modeler was from the IBM team that created it, where there weren't places defined in the documentation, there's aliases for a lot of the same terms, like the one you can see here with the control elements is what we call flow elements, which is where you go to like on and next and et cetera when you're controlling the flow to another a flow or a split or a step or a decider in the Spring Batch. So this is an interesting exercise, and there'll be a lot of trying to realign this as we work through the public review of the draft. Now, I wanted to address properties, and I'll actually show you it actually took, sometimes you're so, ingrained by the way you do things in your paradigm that it's hard to see why they're seeing the problem the way they do. So this property on every artifact was kind of an interesting discussion. In the Spring Batch world, or in the Spring world, it's not even a Spring Batch thing, we have what's called if I get the name correct, it's like a property placeholder configurator. Anybody use that? It's like we use it in all of our context files, right? And so that's where we manage properties that are coming in. There isn't that kind of concept outside of the Spring world, and so there was this idea of how do they get properties into the job, and how do they get properties into the steps, and splits and flows and deciders. And so you'll see this properties everywhere. It's not specifically done in our Spring Batch XSD because we just have another way of doing it, in my opinion, a little more elegant way than what's done in the Java Batch. But they are conceptually the same purpose. And it's just a key value pair. On the other side, you'll notice that we do refer to the job repository in our job spec. And there isn't one in the Java Batch. In the Spring Batch, it's clearly there. Also, the idea of parent and abstract on a job was an interesting discussion because one thing that IBM Batch does. Anybody here used IBM Batch by chance? One thing the IBM Batch job does very well is because they know what their target architecture is, they know how they're going to scale their batch jobs. And I don't want to speak for them because I'll probably get it wrong. I've actually never implemented a job. But in trying to talk to each other about why you need these different things, they were surprised when they saw how we implemented inheritance when we use a parent job. Have any of you used the inheritance feature for job or steps? Okay, so you know that when you inherit from a job, you don't inherit the steps. You inherit the listeners and the attributes. And so they were saying, well, why have inheritance if you're not going to inherit the steps? And it was hard for us to realize that when they talked about partitioning a job, they got into a whole area of semantics that we didn't have anything around in Spring Batch. So they had the ideas of sub-jobs and sub-job analyzers and sub-job collectors and these logical transactions, a lot of semantics that we don't use in the Spring Batch. But I started to appreciate a little bit why they saw this need for the inheritance and the way they were using it. However, we did settle on the Spring Batch use of that, and I think they finally understood why it was that we don't inherit steps, because we can't control the order of the steps as they execute. And so there was valid reason why you don't inherit that when you inherit from your child job from the parents. You don't inherit the steps. So you'll find that these were kind of interesting discussions that we went through. The other thing that, as I move into the steps, again, we pushed a lot of the Spring Batch concepts on step processing. There are subtle differences that we'll talk about. So first of all, partition it is a huge conversation. Probably the biggest area of variance, not so much again in the intention of what we're trying to accomplish, but in the semantics of how we get it done. And so that's an area of the spec that you want to read with interest. And I think because of the discussion, there was a little bit of clarity with the language that we use for partitions. Listeners went in with almost no changes, and in fact felt so valuable that we actually had more listeners added. For example, at the flow listeners, and there's actually an additional scope at flow and split. And also, you'll notice that I don't know why they felt so strongly about changing the term, but we have the term Batchlet now instead of Tasklet. So you say tomato, I say tomato. It's the same thing, So we now have Batchlet term. And then the other thing I'll show that, I think there was such a good job done in the Spring Batch architecture, largely led by Dave Sire. But in the idea that we have the the task executor defined in the step in our meta model, there's obviously not specified in the Java batch around how multiple threads are going to be handled. It's implied through the fact that we have split flows as one type of concurrency model, but there's no task executor in the Java batch. So that's one of the things that you'll see. Now, again, this is the common picture. All I've done was change the name from Batchlet. And again, I'm going to point out that what you see on the right is the Spring Batch XSD, and on the left is the Java Batch, Java XML XSD, and or JSL, sorry, Java Specification Language. What you see on the artifact ref is basically you explode it out as what you'd see on the right. It's where you get the rest of the information you need for the Batchlet. So there's always a reference to an artifact ref. And then, as I pointed out before, the idea of how you pass the properties to this to the artifact. And so we see again that added in at the 11th hour after the JEE review of the spec, the idea of the interfaces. So you can see the interface there, always using the @named, and then you can override through the interfaces. And on the annotation side, you can do the same thing. So you'll see the spec refer to both. As you go through, you pick your flavor. I'm very interested in the community's response on how they feel. I really appreciated Jürgen's keynote on Monday night, because I thought he did a great job of describing the annotations and the context for annotations, and when one type of annotation is useful versus another. For example, when it's used for annotation and injection, etc. I'm not going to say a lot about listeners, because the listeners did stay really basically the way we have it in Spring Batch to manage the life cycle. And again, there was actually a few more added because they saw the value of what we were doing with the listeners. And also, if you read the documentation, largely the same language that we have in the Spring Batch, modeled slightly differently now in the way that you'll notice at the parent level, they don't have the decision. But there are sections on each of these describing and how they, how many people have used the split flow for concurrency? You used that in your batch. So it's one model for our concurrency inside of the steps, is you can describe in your configuration a split flow, and you can have some level of concurrency in your Spring Batch job. I'll go into more detail of the options that you have with partitioning, which is this next slide. So again, this was a big topic. I'll tell you the first thing that was interesting to me is that we had some kind of, if you're in a committee where you're coming from different points of view, there's some hours lost on trying to get to a common ground on what we're talking about. So for example, with partition, when the one team was talking about, I'll just say it was IBM's team, when they're talking about partitioning, partition equal thread. And that's not what partitioning has ever meant to Spring Batch. Partition always meant what we did at a step level to partition the data. And so it took us a while to kind of explain to them that what we do is separate the idea. And now that I've heard their reactions to it, I realize we could have chosen maybe a different name for grid size, which is one of the attributes that we use. But the idea is that the partitions was how we partition the data. We could end up with a lot of partitions, 1,000 partitions, and the grid size, or the number of threads that we use to process a partition, substantially lower number. Might be 8 threads, might be 12 threads, but substantially smaller number than what we use to partition. So partitions line up to get handled by the processing of the partition steps. And in the IBM world, a partition basically meant the thread, and it meant creating a subjob, and then the dispatcher would dispatch that subjob. And so it took a lot of discussion to finally realize that the most portable way to make the batch happen for everybody was to keep the language of Spring Batch on partitioning. So partition means data. And moreover, there was kind of some other people on the team who introduced the idea, well, I get it, this is like Hadoop. And so we started talking about, mappers and reducers. And so the language, Spring Batch has always had these concepts, but they didn't have the same semantics that came up in Java Batch. So you'll see some terms here now. The Partition Mapper, which we call the split something context splitter. Step execution splitter is what we use to partition our job. So we have common names. We actually call it the partitioner and a partition handler that handle these same concepts. And we also have the idea of policies on our partitions. So you can set up both dynamic ways to partition your jobs and static configurations for your jobs. And it takes advantage of our Spring expression language to be able to divide these partitions up. In the Java batch, the terms that were introduced, and I'll kind of step through them quickly, the definitions that we had. The mapper provides a programmatic means for calculating the number of the partitions and the unique properties for each of those. So what I mean by unique properties is like one of the most common scenarios that we had, and I'll just kind of reference the one batch that we did for the state of California. We had 58 counties that we were loading data in. So they would have 58 different drop boxes, locations for each county had their own drop location. And then within those drop location was a set of like 18 files that would map into 23 temporary loading tables. So all of those could be partitioned, right? And we could statically set that up so that we could say we want the addresses, the contacts, the court cases, etc., to be parallelized separately by the partitioner. So you could set up the partitioner to divide that. Now, but that's one way of doing it, but the other problem we have is that population centers are like 3 counties that there was no way we could process the data in a fast enough time without partitioning those files as well. And so that required us like a San Diego and an LA and a Orange County. You had to divide that, you had to chunk that, partition that data into smaller chunks. So that's the role of the partition mapper, is to set up some policies around how you want to partition. We've also always had, and I think the book Spring Batch in Action does such a great job when it covers this topic of how we use ranges, which is exactly how we did it for the state of California, was to have range of key values across the database tables. We found out during the processing time, in that case we were using DB2, that it started to not perform as well if our chunk sizes were something above 50,000 rows. So we'd set up the partitions to be around 50,000 in the chunks of ranges of keys, and then we passed those into the step executions. And so it was kind of interesting reading that chapter from Spring Batch in Action, because they actually could have bet on the same project. There's sometimes only so many ways to think about the problem. So the partition reducer provides a unit of work demarcation around the partition. Again, this kind of gets into the place of where our partition handler takes over, and the partition handler handles these things like collecting and analyzing what's happened in that step execution. And then it returns a status from the step execution, allows the partition handler, in the case of Spring Batch, to determine what has happened in the reducing of the job. And that allows for us, we have multiple ways that we can handle partitioning in the Spring Batch model. We can remote partition, so we have remote workers, or we can use the step executor to handle that on multiple threads. And so I'll step through them kind of quickly, but I've kind of explained them from that slide. Again, there was always two places. Now, what I'll really be interested in, the community feedback, is the variance that we have with what we've done with Spring Batch. In some ways, I kind of like where the committee landed on this, is that I felt like the nouns that were chosen kind of crystallize what's being done in the managing of the partitions. So there's your interface for our Partition Mapper, and you can choose your approach. Also, it was the goal of everybody involved was to make sure we had a dynamic approach. And again, we used the Spring expression language to support that with the step executions that we can pass the values in. And also, we've seen people be able to use the simple examples that we have for like file or JDBC ranges in their batch jobs. Anybody done heavy partitioning with Spring Batch in the audience? Okay, I was curious what you were going to say you used for partitioning your data. So if you get into large jobs, this topic of partitioning is very critical on how you manage. And I've actually found that. I mean, I know there's no raise of hands, but there was a lot of you that raised your hands to use Spring Batch. I really like the way the guys that wrote the Spring Batch in Action described how you scale your batch jobs, because I don't know what the number would be, but I would say that 90% or larger of your batch jobs can really be done in a single thread. It's always that one batch job in your batch schedule that is the queen bee of the project, and that's the one you have to do everything to get it done inside of a batch window. And so then we have multiple strategies to make sure that gets handled. So that's our mapper. That's the interface for a reducer. It's going to be easier if you just go out and look at the spec and see what those interfaces are. But you've gotten the pattern now, right? That the @named is used, and then how you begin a partition step. Before a partition step, again, I was saying that we've added more listeners into the interface. There's your partition collector for collecting the data back, and your partition analyzer. We also added a split collector that has interfaces and annotations. And with both the approach, again, a split analyzer, and that's in our concurrency model in the Spring Batch, and the decider. So point I want to end that with is just to say that all the concepts are in Spring Batch. Really interested in your reaction on how the Java Batch Committee ended on kind of reifying some of these concepts in the specification there. The expression language I've mentioned already for how we substitute variables in the runtime environment when you actually get to your step execution instances and your job instances. The syntax is-spell, I actually have no idea where the JSR is on the expression language in the JEE spec, but I was happy to see that they were willing to accommodate us because we already had an expression language that's used by, I have no idea how to estimate. That's the one challenge with OSS. I'm always surprised at the clients that we call in or call on and we find out they already have Spring Batch projects, they're already using it, but I have no way to like go to job trends and find out how many people are using Spring Batch over, say, IBM's Batch over, say, what other alternatives are there out there in the community. I mentioned the inheritance. I talked about the batch properties, but just wanted to show you an example of what I mean. An example of, now that we've talked about partitioning, sometimes you want to use, or even on the item readers, you know, on this one where you want to specify what the file is that you're reading in. You can see that you set that up as a batch property. Whereas when you look at ours, when we say that flat file item reader that Jonathan used as his example, and you can see that that resource is provided by spell, and that's typically how we do the values that are coming in, and the properties placeholder configurator, I always have a hard time with that name. You can pass that in from the systems property, or you can specify a properties file and configure that, and the Spring world, not just Spring Batch, knows how to handle those properties. There was 2 additional contexts that were added to the Java Batch. We didn't ask for them, but they were added. In fact, I believe Michael Minella wrote an issue on do we really need these additional contexts. But there was a flow context and a split context. And again, remember one of the soft parts of the spec is exactly what metadata, or what you saw as the checkpoint info. That checkpoint info really is that metadata that's going to get stored around your step execution, but there is nothing in the spec that tells what meta information is going to be stored about these running jobs. So nothing is really specified about this metadata from a flow context or a split context that would be stored, and there's nothing in the job operator interface that would access that information. So it's there, and it supplies some more context for them. Not clear yet on how we would use it from a Spring Batch perspective. The transaction management is also, that has been a really large discussion. And again, when you bring 2 parties to the table, there's kind of the JEE way of looking at the transaction model, and the Spring Batch already has a built-in approach for the way we do transaction management. But we fundamentally were able to agree that we really have 2 types of transaction scope environments that we're concerned about. One is the global transaction, which means some type of way of accessing XA resources, and the other is the local transaction. Now, Spring already handles this with the transaction management platform, and so we basically are saying just don't worry about touching that too much, because we already have a solution because of the fact we're built on Spring Core. We don't need a lot said. But again, in the 11th hour with the last change that went into the draft, I was kind of surprised to see that there was an SPI provided for the transaction platform. So there were 2 properties that were added. There was this global mode to say whether we were in global transactions or local transaction. And you just set it true or false. And this is something, by the way, that again, because the IBM batch knows exactly what their target is as far as a WebSphere cluster and what that cluster means as far as the transactions, there are some things they can do with that that allows them to distribute work in a pretty interesting way. Whereas we've never, there are open source JTA managers like Atomicos and Jotum, and there's another, I can't remember the name of the other one, but there are open source JTA transaction managers. I've used Jotum myself in the past on one project. And so the point is that this API allows for things like begin and commit and get status, rollback, set your transaction timeouts, etc. That in the JEE world would just delegate down to properties you'd set on the JTA. And we have similar types, but it's not clear to me yet how we'd implement this on the Spring Batch. I don't think there's a lot of issues, and you're familiar with how we use transactional advice. There are a lot of subtle things. Batch is all about record processing, and a lot of that's still being done to database. And I was interested, I got pulled into a project where they were doing Spring Batch to MongoDB, and the transaction semantics to MongoDB are kind of interesting too when you write to the nodes in MongoDB. So a Batch developer can never get away from the topic of transactions. It's a big topic, and it has implications on where your listeners are at and what the transaction means in the case. So a lot of times skip listeners, for example, are used for logging those records, but you have to make sure you understand the transactional context or the very record you were trying to log that's in a in that transactional context will get rolled back, right? So you need to understand when you need to use transaction requires new, and some of the other transactional semantics. Completely supported by the Spring Batch model, but something that it's the kind of the meat that a batch developer needs to jump into and feel comfortable with. So I mentioned that the metrics, this list of metrics is exactly the same as what you see in Spring Batch. We adopted that. And I kind of had the feeling from the committee it was kind of a time issue, and they were saying, okay, they've already got it, so just shove it in. And so we didn't really talk about whether we were going to enhance what we kept track of. But at least you have what you'd expect to see with the Spring Batch world. And then this becomes kind of the interesting topic. Spend a few minutes on here. We have been all over the map on dependency injection inside the committee. And it's not landed yet where I'm my personal opinion here, it hasn't landed where I want it to land yet. And so my argument was that I've kind of watched what's going on with the JSR-107, which is the data caching, which is interesting to us because we use Gemfire, and Gemfire is also using the data caching API. And so when I watched what Greg Luck was doing, if you see what they do, they actually base the the data caching on dependency injection, but do not specify what dependency injection model you can use. So if you look in their spec, they actually show you how to wire up Juice or wire up Spring DI or wire up CDI. And then in the after the JEE committee, there was kind of this pressure that came back that why isn't this Java batch based on CDI? And we're pushing back saying, come on guys, the CDI is not the predominant dependency injection. And I admit that it's grown, it's gaining popularity, but it is in no way predominant. In fact, the last survey I saw, it's about 11% of the applications are using CDI. Spring is like 60% of the marketplace from all the recent things we've seen. And so I have really pushed back, as has the other committee, and I do again really compliment Chris Vignola. He's tried to really stay in the middle of meeting everybody's concerns about what happened there. But then the pendulum swung completely the other way and say, okay, we won't say anything about DI. And that's not where I wanted it to go either. And so but there's still this almost implication that we have DI because we used, as you saw with the annotations, @named everywhere. And so there is kind of this component model that's implied in all of our annotations and interfaces, but then no mention of DI. The last I saw, which came out September 30th, that we published as the public review of the draft, did not have a mention of DI. So really would appreciate feedback. My personal opinion, I would like the Java batch specification to have DI as a dependency and to use the same model. Now this again is something you should appreciate about the Spring world. It's a homogeneous architecture, and because there's a chief architect at the top, we don't have to argue about what to do with like transaction platform and dependency injection and the way we manage properties and expression languages and on and on. There are so many things we never have to argue about when we're doing a Spring-based architecture. This happens to be one where I wish the JCP process had kind of a standard approach for how they manage this problem, and then we could use that standard approach. Right now, it's still, in my opinion, a very open issue about where we land, and it's so core to how we do batch. Spring batch is not, it just doesn't work without dependency injection. Yeah, someone else had asked me about the JSR-299. What is it by name?
That's called context CDI.
Oh, that is the CDI, right. Yeah, and what was your question then?
I think there's a debate on whether to use that version of Spring.
Yeah, that is a debate. And their argument was they're saying, well, there are open source implementations of CD. There's Apache Weld, and there's another one that they named. I'm not really familiar with that space, but they were giving some other examples that you can use other CDI implementations. But that wasn't our point. Our point is that we need dependency injection, but we don't really have an interest in CDI. And nor do we feel like the Spring world is really interested in the CDI world, although I don't speak for Spring engineering. I'm an application developer just like the rest of you. Other questions? Okay, let me just summarize by saying I can't tell you how much I would appreciate, and now's the critical time to do it because it's just gone into public review. If you have opinions about the way we've done things on working on this Java batch standardization, would really appreciate you going out to the Java.net projects JBatch and opening issues, raising issues, commenting on on the open issues that are already out there, especially since that open issue around the XSD just got out there. And I also want to finish by talking about I've implied lots of places. I mentioned when someone asked a question, we didn't say anything about instrumentation. We got into that topic. We actually, in the early days, said we got to make sure we come back to it. We never got back to it. So there's nothing really talked about in the how we instrument. And you know, in Spring Batch, we supplied RESTful API with what's been done with Spring Batch Admin, and we also have JMX exporters, tooling for the Spring Batch. So that's an area that's kind of an interesting omission from the Java Batch. The other area I've mentioned repeatedly that I have mixed feelings. I'm actually kind of glad we didn't get into the repository because I do believe there are things about that that make it nicer if it's a vendor implementation. Having the Java operator kind of be the interface for that is probably okay. The other thing that I feel like people are going to be interested in is this whole library of what do you do with this rich library of item readers and writers that are used by the Spring Batch, which again, I have no way of determining what in the Java enterprise world, what percentage that constitutes. But I believe that people are going to want to portably move these things if they do run them inside of another architecture. And it was interesting that one of the members of the committee, Joe Poland, is from the UBS. He's not actually a UBS employee, but that's been a project he's been heavily involved in. And they're a heavy Spring Batch user. It was kind of interesting to hear how they use Spring Batch in a WebLogic clustered environment and why they made some of the decisions they made in that environment. So the whole topic of what does distributed batch look like was something that we realized that we needed to table. And yet it comes up with every large client that uses Spring Batch. They want to know what our best practices are for distributed. Now, what I will tell you is that we have an architect working in the vFabric team. His name is Jeff Holmes. And we just released what we're calling Spring Trader. Have you ever heard the announcement on Spring Trader? It is a reference architecture for how you use the vFabric runtimes. And as the next version, I'm working with Jeff on this, we're actually including how you scale out the Spring Batch for a distributed grid using TC server and using load balancers, etc. So look to see that for some examples on what we're doing with distributed batch. But one of the big problems that we talked about, and I have to admit that I've gained a lot of respect for what IBM has done with the fact they know what their target is, right? If you're going to an IBM XD and you know what that distributed grid looks like, you can make some assumptions about how you deploy and redispatch the jobs onto your distributed grid. It's a topic that we're a little bit vague on in Spring Batch. We need to get a little bit more firm on how do you get workers that are processing the chunks, the remote chunks in a distributed grid, how that gets coordinated and handled. And some of the decisions we have to make is that if we pass the chunks over to the distributed workers like on the JMS, item reader writers, who actually controls the step? There's the one idea is that you pass the chunk over on the message, which can be pretty big sometimes, and that when it returns to the step, it's still that partition handler that knows how to commit. And then some of the other patterns we're seeing is that people actually will use the claim check pattern, like passing the range of values on the chunk, and then the workers know how to go to a common location to get that work to process. So that's a whole area that is really what we're brought in to help with when we come into a Spring Batch project, is they want to know how you distribute this on a grid, and also the big topic about what to do with grids. We did have some fairly long discussions in our committee meetings on what to do about the idea of distributed grids, and certainly vendors want to support that, and you'll be seeing a lot more from us in the idea of, I mentioned earlier, on item readers and writers and what we are suggesting on distributed grids, but not addressed by the Java batch spec in the least. It was the intention was we'll approach it later. Question in the back?
So it sounds like there are going to be a lot of sort of incompatible implementations, and there are a lot of missing pieces of the spec. So what's really your goal for the abstraction?
So there are see, that was actually one of my concerns about giving this talk. Worried about giving it too early because, like I said, the public review just went out September 30th. And so I think there's more incompatibilities just because of the point we're at, where we're talking about it. And you'll see a lot of those compatibilities get resolved as the issues are resolved. Our goal, at least from a VMware perspective, our goal was to make sure that the ideas that we presented to the Java enterprise community on how you do batch got preserved with the standard. And in retrospect, I feel like that part of the goal has been met. And I think as you see us homogenize the differences between the Spring Batch namespace and the Java batch, what they call the JSL, the Java specification language, I think you'll begin to see that normalized. But then there's always been the idea that how do you get a spec to a point where it makes things clear for the developers but leaves vendors the options to add value to that. So what we're really trying to do with the goal is to have a common programming model for the developer, and to some extent, well, to a large extent, the operator as to how they administer the jobs. But we don't want to get in the way of the vendor. Myself, you know, again, I don't speak for engineering, but as we work for Spring Batch, we don't want to get in the way of us being able to innovate what we're implementing in Spring Batch. Does that help? Yeah, and you're right. I notice your head shaking. The jury's out, right, as to where we're going to meet this or not. You know, that's why we need your opinions out there. Yes.
And so Oracle's ready for the DRI for this?
No, IBM is written, and that was actually one of our. That's kind of an interesting dynamic as well, because we were hoping it'd be a GitHub project and be available for people to contribute. It didn't end up that way, and quite frankly, we were kind of scrambling for resources ourselves on, you know, say we went to sign up and say, well, first of all, we volunteered, let's just have Spring Batch be the RI, and that was rejected by the group. So IBM wrote the RI, but then it's not to a point yet where we can really validate whether how seamless we can make it for Spring Batch jobs. I mean, I want to be able to take, say, Spring Batch samples and run them through Java Batch and not have to make any changes. So that's our ideal by the time we're done. We use our Spring Batch libraries, you know, for readers and writers, but I want to be able to run those through. And so now I'm kind of having to stand in line a little bit. The best we can do is open defects and wait for them to turn the RI around. The commitment is that the RI will match the spec before we're done. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, thanks a lot. Oh, one more?
Yeah.
Repeat the question.
With the conversation, Spring Integration, Spring Batch, and new concept like Whisper or circuit breaker, very nice, but thinking those would be considered for the next iteration, like for example, even a task, right? Those failing, we tried times, and so instead of filling the whole batch, those chunks could be incorporated pattern.
Right. The question is about some of the work that's being done now with this kind of integrating Spring integration with Spring Batch and where we're going with that. And I'll be honest with you, I haven't kept up on a lot of that. But it is exciting, and there's enhancements to what Spring Batch is doing. So, for example, the work being done with Spring Batch Hadoop, and we're starting to get requests for, help on those types of models. And obviously, none of that's been addressed by Java Batch. Okay, thank you.